views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
All right, welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have three distinct issues on today's show to discuss. The first one is facial recognition and the use of law enforcement, whether or not it's legal or illegal. Very important. Second issue we have is T-Mobile. Been overcharging customers, selling used phones. We have someone here to discuss that. And finally, very excited, we have a representative from the Israeli Consulate here, high-ranking, discuss Israeli and U.S. relations. A lot to discuss, so stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have a very interesting guest today, Albert Fox Cahn. He is the executive director at a surveillance technology oversight project. Albert, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This topic is fascinating because it involves facial recognition. And I have to tell you, just opening up my laptop right now to be able to do this interview, facial recognition was all that was needed for me to be able to start my communications with you. So it's obviously just becoming a part of my life and a part of everyone's life. But the reason we have you here today is we may be seeing some type of abuse when it comes to facial recognition. So tell me what your thoughts are in terms of facial recognition and your position.
Yeah, so facial recognition is biased, it's broken, and when it does work, it's actually a threat to democracy. So let's start with the bias piece. Facial recognition works pretty well for me. It works pretty well for someone who's middle-aged, who's white, who's cis, but for someone who is a woman of color, for someone who's trans, or someone who's older, for someone who's a teenager, well, then the error rates start going up and you start getting a lot more difficulties with the technology.
How do we know that? How do we know that someone like you and I, they'd have no problem in terms of matching the facial recognition to the actual person, but yet somebody of color, transgender, why? And why is that not the same as what you and I have to deal with?
Well, I mean, this is the structural racism we see with a lot of forms of artificial intelligence. So Joy Buolamwini, a researcher who was at MIT at the time, did amazing work in this field. The folks at NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, they did incredible work looking at the error rates. And they would take the exact same algorithm, the exact same piece of software, feed it images, and what they would find is that the software kept getting it wrong far more often, sometimes hundreds of times more often, for darker skinned women of color, particularly Black women.
I'm just wondering if we're at least advancing to the point that we can even it out. But do we know if that's even ever going to happen?
Well, part of the problem is even if you fix the algorithm, even if you fix the software itself and bring some of the racism there under control, you still have all of these other forms of bias. So let's look at the way that the facial recognition system is used here in New York, where you have the NYPD deploying their facial recognition algorithms. They're not comparing it to everyone's photos. They're just comparing it to mugshots of people who have previously been arrested. So once again, you're using this skewed example to only provide a distorted view of who can and cannot be a match, because overwhelmingly it's been Black and Latinx New Yorkers who have been arrested, who have had their mugshots in the system over the years.
So what's happening? Is that the police are scanning in the mugshots and then using the software so that they can be identified somewhere else? Maybe you can walk me through it.
Yeah, so what you do is you take something called a probe image. Now, it's a fancy way of just saying any image from a crime scene, from a bystander video, from CCTV, from someone's cell phone, and you take that video clip or that still image and you run it through a facial recognition database that's run by the NYPD. They use software called DataWorks Plus, and what DataWorks Plus does, it doesn't come back and say, oh, we've got the guy, we've got a match. What it does is every single time you run a search, it gives you a list of 250 photos that it says are the closest quote unquote match to the photo that you provided. And then a couple of detectives will sit around their laptop, look at those 250. They'll say, oh, I think it's that person. And then they'll send that image to detectives. And so what you end up doing is introducing this pseudoscientific technique that involves a lot of guesswork, a lot of sloppy practices, and it really can put people at huge risk of false arrest and a police encounter.
Have the police used the facial recognition in terms of arrests, or are they still in the process of implementing and using it with respect to everything else in terms of law enforcement?
Well, here's where it gets tricky, because the NYPD will say we have never arrested anyone on the basis of facial recognition. So they've used it more than 10,000 times last year. They've used it more than 22,000 times in the last 3 years. And they say in none of those cases was someone arrested solely because of facial recognition. It's just a tip. But what we know because of researchers at Georgetown University is the way it looks in practice is that you had detectives getting a so-called facial recognition match, sending that image to an eyewitness and saying, is this the guy? Literally, that was the whole text message. And so now you have this eyewitness who's getting a photo of someone who looks similar, is saying, yes, I think that's a guy. And so now that eyewitness identification is the supposed basis of the arrest. But the truth is that there are a lot of New Yorkers who would never have been arrested and never would have had police at their door without facial recognition.
What about teenagers, children? Are they being used, or in terms of scanning their face?
There's no restriction on how people's images are being used. And we even know that the NYPD teamed up with the controversial vendor Clearview AI, a private firm that is making money by selling our images to law enforcement. They've scraped more than 3 billion images off the web and used it to create a facial recognition database so that police can then go and pull up people's images, including young children.
Well, let me just put on the other hat for a second. There, children go missing all the time, whether they're runaways or somebody snatches them. Wouldn't this be a good way for law enforcement to be able to find them if they need to look for them?
Well, one major issue is that facial recognition is actually a lot less reliable for young children. It's one of those groups I was listing at the beginning where you have higher error rates. On top of that, you have the issue that the way that these facial recognition searches are being run in practice are far worse than what was being studied in a lab, because we know that oftentimes, the NYPD is using the software, and before they even run the facial recognition search, what they're doing is they're photoshopping the image, because the software is so crude that it doesn't actually work unless you Photoshop the eyes open, or you Photoshop the mouth closed, or Photoshop it so that you have a symmetrical image. But that's not how photos look in the real world.
So what is a surveillance technology oversight project trying to do? What is your mission?
So we're a New York-based privacy and civil rights group. So we do a lot of open records litigation to try to pull back the curtain and see how this technology is being used. We're currently pursuing a number of cases against the NYPD here in New York. We also had a class action settlement where we stopped the NYPD's policy of removing religious head coverings from arrestees, and that was being done because they wanted those uncovered photos in the facial recognition database. And we also are pushing legislation to ban facial recognition in New York City and New York State.
Are you getting support from the different assemblymen and the council members?
We are definitely seeing a lot of support. One issue right now is that the speaker's office hasn't allowed the bill to come forward so far. They haven't allowed the legislative request for the facial recognition ban to be introduced. And I think it's really important that Speaker Johnson listen to New Yorkers and bring forward this legislation.
I know Senator Brad Holyman has recently said that facial recognition technology threatens to end every New Yorker's ability to walk down the street anonymously. That's where we're heading. I mean, isn't really that's where we're going with this, Albert? Really?
It's a dystopian scenario. It's not just an absent fear. It's not just this like hypothetical. We found out this weekend that 3 police departments in Florida were tracking Black Lives Matter protesters simply for coming out and demonstrating using facial recognition. We found out yesterday that according to the GAO, 6 federal law enforcement agencies had done the exact same thing. And so we are telling people, well, you have the right to assemble, you have the right to come out and protest, but we're going to track you and put you in a database for doing it.
Well, Albert, we're going to have to leave it there. This is one of those interesting topics that I'm sure we're going to need you back to discuss. Thanks very much. Maybe a couple of weeks, couple of months, you'll come back and give us an update.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Welcome back to today's verdict. We have with us right now Israel Nitzan. He's the acting Consul General of Israel in New York. Israel, thanks for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, I was excited when I found out you were coming on, only because, and this is something that's not new that I was telling you, I'm a Jewish boy who grew up in Queens, and there was a certain amount of goodwill really that was there following World War II that, you know, I almost feel has been eroding over time, which unfortunately has led to anti-Semitism and the rise in anti-Semitism. Just wanted to start off in terms of your thoughts on that. Do you feel that maybe we're at a point where we're losing some kind of relationship with the community? What are your initial thoughts, really?
I think, first of all, I should say that I'm not sure that there is an erosion here. I think that, yes, there are some political and social developments. There's also, let's talk about anti-Semitism. So we are 8 decades after the Holocaust. Unfortunately, I have to say, people are, especially the younger generation, is less familiar, less educated, and I think that this is our responsibility, both as the representatives of the State of Israel, but also I think that as one family with the Jewish community here, to make sure that people are being educated and are familiar with history, know that people know what happened in World War II during the Holocaust. They know about the final solution and the annihilation, the attempt to annihilate our people. And I think that the key, first of all, is education. We're also working at the consulate in engaging with other communities, with other elected officials, in emphasizing the importance of fighting anti-Semitism. We, as a foreign diplomatic mission, we may not have the authority to act abroad, but I think that as the representatives of the Jewish state, we have a historic and moral responsibility to speak up and to call out anti-Semitism and to act in order to protect our family and our sisters and brothers abroad.
Now, how do you do that from a grassroots perspective? In other words, how do you do it with, community members, let's say from the Bronx? We've had a couple of synagogues that have been vandalized. How do you get the word out so that it reaches the people throughout New York City?
First of all, well, in the Bronx, I only yesterday I spent a day actually in the Bronx. Had some meetings with elected officials and some community leaders. We're in touch, first of all, with the Jewish community, because at the end of the day, it's not only our problem. First of all, it's the problem of the local community. We try to help. We try to help in identifying the relevant partners in order to assist to build the needed coalitions in order to fight not only hatred and racism, but actually to fight specifically anti-Semitism. One more dimension, or let's say component, that is very relevant today is the IRA working definition. The IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an international forum of about 40 states, led by the United States and Israel. IRA adopted a working definition to anti-Semitism that is a non-legally binding definition. And we believe that there should be more governments internationally, but also local states and local administrations, like, for example, Nassau County Nassau County on Long Island, as well as there was a statement also by Steve Ballone, the county executive of Suffolk, in basically endorsing or intending or making a statement on the plan to endorse the IRA working definition, to make things clear, to know, because at the end of the day, if you want to fight anti-Semitism, you need first of all to define it.
Which leads me to the colleges throughout the country. It's a little disheartening for me to see sometimes what's going on there, and that they're very insulated, the liberal colleges. What can or cannot be done to try and prevent some of these movements that are very anti-Israel? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that first of all, as I said, first of all, education from a very young generation, from a very young age, to know about to learn about Jewish history. I'm talking not only about the younger Jewish generation, but actually in the general society. I think that first of all, education. Secondly, we engage regularly with the schools themselves, with the administration of the colleges and the campuses. We believe that the chancellors, the presidents, and the leadership of these institutions have actually a responsibility in educating the future leadership of the United States. So it's not only a matter of giving them the best education possible or teaching them certain methods, but actually to make them good and positive leaders, to denounce hatred and to reject anti-Semitism, of course.
So look, Israel really now has a new administration, has a new prime minister. We have a new president. Things are always changing. We have a new mayor now. So what are your thoughts? Do you think there's going to be a little bit more of a commonality of interest? Maybe just, we don't have too much time, but what do you think?
I think that, first of all, I think that there is always commonality of interest, but not only interest. We share values, and this is part of our special relationship. Yes, there is a new government in Israel. There is also a new, there were elections here, primarily at least, in New York City. We had a very important, by the way, we have a very important meeting these days in Israel. It's a bipartisan leadership delegation led by Congressman Greg Meeks from New York, who is a great friend. And he spoke yesterday at the 4th of July event in the embassy, the US Embassy in Washington, in a very strong statement, actually emphasizing our shared values, the very strong and solid basis for our relationship, what makes our relationship so strong, the commitment to bipartisanship, that these relationships are not based on interests, not on security, not on political interests, but actually on our shared values as democracies, as liberal democracies. And I think that this is a very solid ground which we should keep on building our relationship.
Well, certainly the Israeli-US relationship has a lot of history. Both countries need each other. We want to thank you very much for coming on, Israel. Hopefully you come back. And listen, it's a tough time for all of us, but Israel's important. So we'll just leave it there.
New York is important also for us in the United States and this relationship. And thank you so much, David.
It's our pleasure. All right. So much more coming up. Today's verdict, right back after this. All right, well, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We have with us today, Michael Tiger. He's the Deputy General Counsel. This is a tough one, out of the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. Michael, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, David.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the settlement. Great number when it comes to worker protection and, or should I say, T-Mobile and the consumer protections. Tell the viewers a little bit about how you even came to be notified that there may have been some type of issue with overcharging, et cetera, with T-Mobile.
Absolutely, David. So we have a consumer services division that you can go on our website, you can go through 311, and you can provide complaints about any business to our agency, and our consumer service division will take it in where appropriate. They may mediate the complaint, but they're really the resource for the entire agency for our lawyers to be able to track what consumer harms are happening on the ground. Sometimes I like to say that there are top-down investigations. We hear about something in a news story, or we hear something from an elected official, and we pursue an investigation based on things that we hear and documents that we receive from companies. Here, this was really a bottom-up, and that's where a lot of our investigations happen, is we look at the trends in the consumer complaints that we receive. And here, we receive dozens of complaints about Metro by T-Mobile, Metro PCS stores throughout the cities, across the 5 boroughs, with all sorts of consumer deception, including selling used phones as new and overcharging consumers for different fees, maybe fees that the Metro PCS stores should not have charged, or duplicative fees, but all sorts of consumer harms. As a result of those complaints, we started to look into the businesses more closely. We issued subpoenas, and that landed us with eventually filing a complaint in state Supreme Court.
How long did it take from beginning to end, from when you first really were notified to the point where you actually reached the settlement?
I would say roughly 3 years. Of course, in the intervening time is the pandemic. I think from the time we really started to look at the complaints, issue subpoenas to T-Mobile, to the time we actually reached a resolution of the case, it was roughly 3 years. And I mean, your listeners should know that oftentimes investigations do take that long.
Now, was this with intent, should we say, in the legal field? Was this knowingly done by T-Mobile and the subsidiaries, or was this really just a negligent type of behavior? How would you characterize it?
I don't think, I'd be careful not to really characterize it one way or the other. I think the allegations in our complaint speak for themselves. We're just happy that we can make the consumers whole based on the restitution fund that is established as part of this settlement, that T-Mobile is paying civil penalties to the tune of $306,000 for the conduct alleged in the complaint, and that consumers are educated about what's going on.
Well, talk to me how this is broken up. How much of it goes into the pockets of the consumers? How do you find out who gets it? As opposed to, maybe more of a symbolic gesture? What exactly, how would you characterize the money itself?
Well, this is definitely more than symbolic, David. As you said before, there's a $306,000 that's going in civil penalties that goes to the city for violations of our city consumer protection law. But then there's a separate component of the settlement of $100,000 to establish a claims fund. So if you were deceived by T-Mobile by Metro PCS stores since 2016, you can go to our website. There's a form that you can fill out, and if you meet the criteria to get compensated, you'll be compensated through that claims fund. So just go to our website. There's $100,000 as part of the agreement to seed a restitution fund, and hopefully we can make consumers who are harmed by the deceptive conduct whole.
I know this is happening with T-Mobile, but there are so many other companies, whether it's Verizon, AT&T, wherever, that people are buying their phones. They're buying it at Apple. They're buying it everywhere, and we cannot do without our phones. Do other companies see this as a ripple effect? In other words, do you think that the other companies will take this into consideration when they're selling phones at their particular stores?
Well, I mean, we always hope that with our investigations, it sends a message to industries to create a culture of compliance across the industry. So we'll see how the news of this investigation, the resolution of this investigation through the settlement has an impact on the industry as a whole.
Tell me, what else is your organization working on? What other types of investigations are going on that you can share with us? I don't know what you can.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we can't really comment on ongoing investigations too much. But we license over 50 different business categories in the city, and we're always looking to make sure that the businesses that we license are in compliance and with the various laws and rules, including the consumer protection law. But we also look at businesses that we don't license, and we try to sort of look at systemic consumer harm under the consumer protection law, and where appropriate, bring cases in state Supreme Court.
So Lorelei Salas has been on the show several times, and she's discussed in detail some of the overcharging that was occurring during the pandemic. Has that seemed to slow down a little bit, or is that still something your agency is looking at?
Well, it's something we're always interested in. During the pandemic, we promulgated a price gouging rule under our powers under our consumer protection law, and we used a lot of our resources to be out in the street and make sure that communities across the city were not being taken advantage of. And I have to say, the number of consumer complaints that we have received over the course of the pandemic for price gouging has gone down. So hopefully the work that we have done in that space, both by passing the rule, educating the public, and actually prosecuting cases in an administrative tribunal, have had a salutary effect, and businesses have taken notice, and that there has been less price gouging. That's certainly our hope, and we have received fewer consumer complaints.
So let me ask you a question. So let's say one of the viewers here, let's say in the Bronx, they go into a store or someplace and they fear they're being overcharged, or there's some kind of deceptive practice that's going on. How do they first notify somebody? Do they go to the manager? Should they put it in writing? Do they go right to you? Tell me how what you would recommend.
Well, there's different ways you can approach it. I mean, I will say, from a consumer education standpoint, you should always do your research before you buy a product. Make sure that you understand all the papers that they're giving you, any contracts that you're signing, financing agreements, any receipts that they give you. Make sure that you understand every item on the receipt, what it stands for. And you shouldn't be afraid of talking to the business and making them answer questions. If after the fact you feel that you've been ripped off, either because your product's not working or it's not what they said it was, or you look at the paperwork and you're like, what is this charge? You definitely can file a complaint. We encourage you to file a complaint with our agency. At top, I talked about our consumer service division. They are there to take in consumer complaints, so we know what's happening, and if where possible, we can make consumers whole.
Well, great stuff, Michael. We really appreciate it. We're going to have to leave it there. We'd love to have you back. I know you guys do such great work there protecting the public. And that's really it. Just have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you, David.
It's our pleasure. All right, stay with us. So much more. Today's verdict coming up right after this. Well, that's all that we have for today's show. I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for watching. And of course, if you have an issue or topic you would like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict with David Lesch, just let me know. Email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. Until the next time, know the law, reach a verdict. See you in 2 weeks.